The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
Continuing the video Bible reading of the book of Acts, we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 19, verses 21 through 41, as we begin installment number 61 in this series. In the previous portion, in number 60, where we had a portion of Acts chapter 19, we looked at the experience in particular of some fellows who were trying to capitalize on Paul's power. There were great miracles being done by the hands of Paul, and even through artifacts, handkerchiefs and aprons that had been in contact with his body. People were being healed, evil spirits were being cast out just by contact with those items. And a lot of people were believing, and then there were these 7 exorcists, Jewish exorcists, who tried to capitalize on the idea without being followers of Jesus. And so they instructed an evil spirit to come out of a man based on commanding in the name of the Lord Jesus, commanding in the name of Jesus, whom Paul preaches, as they put it. And that did not work out well for them, but it worked out very well as a testimony to the efficacious power of Jesus, whom Paul preached, in fact, that actually knowing Jesus and actually working in his name was quite different than that superficial attempt to capitalize on the name of Jesus that they had done. And so, as we come into Acts chapter 19, verse 21, the verse begins with, after these things, and that would be after the baptizing of the 12 who had known the baptism of John and their gift of the Spirit through the laying on of Paul's hands, and after the 7 sons of Sceva had been beaten, and after the burning of the scrolls and artifacts of magic by the Christians in Ephesus, their own. They weren't going around burning what belonged to other people. They were bringing them out of their own houses and burning them. Some $6 million worth in terms of our money in our times. But picking up Acts 19, verses 21 through 41, and read this lengthy segment. After these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I've been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. About that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way, for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades, and said, Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth, and you see and hear that not only in Ephesus but almost in all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with human hands, or gods made with hands, are not gods. And there's danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. When they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So the city was filled with confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him, and even some of the Asiarchs who were friends of his sent to him, and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Now some cried out one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward, and Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours they all cried out with one voice, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, Men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis, and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky? Seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. If therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly, for we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. And when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. So verse 21, after these things, after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to go through Macedonia and Achaia and to Jerusalem. and thought that he would then from Jerusalem make arrangements to go to Rome. And meanwhile, he sent from Ephesus at this point in time 2 helpers, Timothy and Erastus, while he stayed in Asia. They went to Macedonia while he continued on in Asia. And the fact that it mentions in Asia, again, strengthens what Luke had previously mentioned, that the word was spreading from Paul's work in Asia, in Ephesus, was spreading all over the region of Asia. And so Paul stayed in Asia for a while, using Ephesus as a base, as a center for his activities. Paul wanted to visit Macedonia again. And from Ephesus, which is on the western coast of Asia, he would have traveled by boat, a similar journey to what he had previously made from Troas back in the 16th chapter. He would have traveled by ship across over to Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea, as he had done previously back in the 16th chapter of Acts. We read about these churches, and he also mentions going to Achaia here, which would include the churches at Corinth, Athens, and Cenchrea, which we read about in the 17th and 18th chapters of Acts. We read about these various churches that they wanted to revisit, and the preparation they made that Paul wanted to revisit. And then he wanted and was making preparations to go to Jerusalem. And in preparation for that travel and that visit, he sent Timothy and Erastus to prepare the way for his own journey. This is the time when Timothy was away, right here where Timothy is gone to go to Macedonia and Achaia, making way for Paul to follow a little later. This is the very time when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. Timothy's trip is mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. Paul there mentioned Timothy's journey also in chapter 16 of the book of 1 Corinthians. And in that letter, he noted that he intended to remain in Ephesus until Pentecost before visiting Macedonia and Achaia, as mentioned here in Acts. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 5 through 11, Paul wrote to the Corinthian church from Ephesus, "I will visit you after passing through Macedonia, for I intend to pass through Macedonia, and perhaps I'll stay with you or even spend the winter with you so that you may help me on my journey wherever I go. For I do not want to see you now just in passing. I hope to spend some time with you, if the Lord permits. But I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost, for a wide door of effective work has opened to me, and there are many adversaries. When Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease among you, for he's doing the work of the Lord as I am. So let no one despise him. Help him on his way in peace, that he may return to me, for I am expecting him with the brothers." So note that Paul here wrote that Timothy would come to them, but Timothy's travels were already underway by the time Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, as the scenario that's described here in verse 22. Paul also wrote of expecting Timothy to come back to Ephesus before he himself left. "I'll stay here probably until Pentecost," he said. So he's in the winter months in Ephesus, and he's not ready to travel yet. That did happen, that Timothy came back to Paul in Ephesus before Paul left Ephesus, as we'll see a little bit later on. We'll see the implication of that. Timothy was not traveling to Corinth with an aim to help them. He wasn't going there to shore up the church or anything like that, which the 1 Corinthian letter certainly addresses issues that they had that needed to be resolved. That wasn't the purpose of Timothy's trip, and he wouldn't have really known that that was going on there. They didn't have cell phones or multimedia or any of these kinds of things. In fact, the trip that Timothy was making, preparing for Paul's own journey, was at least in part to urge the churches among the nations to prepare for sending a financial gift to the churches of Jerusalem and Judea. Paul wrote about that particularly in 2 Corinthians in chapters 7, 8, 9, and also he wrote about that in Romans. In the 15th chapter of Romans mentioned this in just within a short time of when he wrote this letter to 1 Corinthians. Some months after 1 Corinthians. His planned visit to Jerusalem we'll read about in Acts chapter 21, 22, and he also mentions that visit to Jerusalem in Romans chapter 15. And part of the reason he wanted to go to Jerusalem was to take this collection for the saints gathered up by churches in Asia and Macedonia and Galatia and Achaia and carry that to Jerusalem. A significant financial aid for the churches among the Gentiles. So that's part of what was behind his travel plans and sending Timothy and Erastus on ahead. His hope to go to Rome, we'll see, would be fulfilled, but not in the manner in which he anticipated, not so much the way he was hoping to go to Rome, as we'll see when we get to Acts chapter 22 and following. Pentecost is in the late spring, 7 Sabbaths plus 1 day after Passover. And as Passover is the anniversary of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, so Pentecost is the anniversary of the outpouring of the Spirit, as reported in Acts chapter 2. On the day of Pentecost, they were all together in one place, and the Spirit came on them. Note, too, that in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 9, Paul wrote that he had a wide door for effective work there in Asia, in Ephesus and in Asia, and also that there were many adversaries. And we're just about to get into the story of some of those adversaries to the work that Paul was doing. We're about to see just how effective the work was and just how ardent some of his Ephesian adversaries were. So verse 23, Acts 19:23, about that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way, for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. And so we have an account following then of a riot at Ephesus. But let's take a moment to think about this Artemis of the Ephesians. We're not going to look at this in great detail, but let's take a moment to think about this Artemis of the Ephesians, drawing from a few notes in the Archaeological Study Bible notes. Artemis of the Ephesians, Artemis of Ephesus, was an enormously popular deity all over that region of the world, in fact, over much of the Roman world. One Greek writer stated that she was the goddess most worshipped in private devotions in the Mediterranean world. She was extremely popular. Her cult was her idol was a little bit unusual because it had a stiff, elongated body with legs bound together. And by the way, we could include a depiction of the idol here, but I chose to leave that off. There are extant statues, images, not the original one that was in the temple itself in Ephesus, but there are coins with her likeness that have survived to this day, and there are images of Artemis of Ephesus in various places in the Roman world. The upper half of the front torso was covered with protuberances resembling human breasts, so that she was sometimes called the many-breasted Artemis. She wore a necklace of acorns, for the oak tree was sacred to her. Her breastplate had the signs of the zodiac. Her head had a crown, often topped with the turrets of the city of Ephesus. And the crown may have concealed a meteorite that had fallen to earth. Acts 19:35 mentioned this stone that had fallen from heaven, the image that had fallen from heaven. Frequently, her skirt was decorated with rows of animals, indicating her being a fertility goddess. And along the sides were bees depicted as both actual insects and as priestesses. The priestesses in the temple of Artemis were referred to as honeybees. And adorned with crowns and wings, the honeybees had these crowns and wings. Artemis herself was known as the queen bee, and her male priests that served in her temple were castrated, and they were called drones. So they were drawing on that imagery of fertility and the production that the hive engages in and so forth. Her image appears on coins, papyri, wall paintings, reliefs, statuettes, and in larger statuary, especially that which was in the temple itself. Some 50 stone statues of Artemis have been excavated at ancient sites in widely separated parts of the ancient world. Again, she was very popular and widely appealed to as a helper, a savior, a fertility goddess, and so forth. In the shrine that was there in the days of Paul, the final shrine of Artemis, the temple of Artemis in Ephesus, was considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And thousands of priests, thousands of personnel served within the confines of that sanctuary. It was enormous. And huge sums of money were brought and entrusted to the keeping of Artemis, which the same thing was true of other temples. When Paul mentions in Romans, do you who abhor idolatry, do you rob temples? Temples were the banks of the ancient world. They were repositories of wealth, both of gifts that were donated and also things that were brought in for safekeeping. And that included the temple at Jerusalem. The money boxes at Jerusalem, there was enormous temple treasure that belonged to the temple itself, that the priests were guardians of, and then also people came to the temple for the sake of safe deposit places to put wealth that they had accumulated. But huge sums of money were entrusted to the keeping of Artemis, and as a result, the temple complex became the major banking center of Asia. When this guy says that Artemis is a big deal, he wasn't kidding. Artemis was a big deal in the culture of ancient Asia and the Mediterranean world in Ephesus. This business of the silver shrines was no little business, as he says. What we do brings no little business. Indeed, This was no little business. It was a huge, very successful economic enterprise that was taking place here. So he went to his fellow craftsmen, these men who worked in making the shrines for Artemis, and he gathered them together with the workmen in similar trades, people whose trades were related to metalworking, and Paul would later write about to Timothy that there was a particular coppersmith who was an ardent opponent and it caused him a lot of problems. And that may have been someone who was engaged in this. In fact, some of those engaged in similar trades may even have included Jews who were engaged in metalwork, even though they had no part in the idolatry or no direct participation in the idolatry of the temple of Artemis, as we're going to see a reference to Alexander in the course of this series of verses. Men, you know the business. In this business we have our wealth, and you see and hear that not only in Ephesus but almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. Well, indeed, he said something similar to that when he was at Athens back in Acts chapter 17, that God is not worshipped in temples made by human hands. He doesn't need what human hands produce. So no doubt Paul had been teaching some close variant of what he was accused of here, saying that gods that men make with their hands are not gods. Paul certainly was teaching that sort of method, that this was empty, that it was futile, that the living God doesn't need these kinds of images and devices. In fact, doesn't want, because he has made man in his own image. And there's a danger, this silversmith said. There is a danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but the temple itself may be neglected. And we know, in fact, that not only from Luke's testimony here in Acts, but also from other surviving documents from the ancient era, from Alexandria and Egypt, for example, a priest at a pagan temple had written a complaint that these Nazarenes, that is the followers of Jesus, the Nazarenes, were taking away so much business from the temple that the temple was in danger of closing its doors. And there was a particular engineer, a particular Greek engineer in those days, who was engaged in the production of fake miracles for the temples, doors that were closed and opened hydraulically so that a hidden priest could open and close the doors, and fires that started seemingly by magic that had hidden bellows and hidden devices and so on and so forth. But there was a great effort at this point in time, in the second half of the first century AD, to augment the authority of the temples and to combat the rising, growing Christian faith and the miraculous events associated with the Christian faith. So you see and hear that this is having an effect all over Asia, all over the world, that what this man Paul is preaching is having an effect. And the temples are beginning to see an effect, and it's going to get worse. And in fact, it eventually did get worse. Eventually, the temple of Artemis in Ephesus was destroyed once Christianity became the effective religion of the Roman Empire. Eventually, that structure was destroyed and replaced with a structure devoted to the worship of Christ. There's danger not only this trade of ours may come, but of course that destruction is several centuries after the present moment in time. There's danger that not only our trade may come into disrepute, but even the temple itself. And again, that did eventually happen. Artemis may be counted as nothing and may be deposed from her magnificence. Well, it was a magnificence imposed by humans, and so she could certainly be deposed by humans and by following the word of the Lord. She whom all Asia and the world worship. And that's not far from the truth. As we've already noted from the notes from the Archaeological Study Bible, she was a popular deity all over the Mediterranean world, all over the Roman world of that time. And when these craftsmen heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So the city was filled with confusion. Mobs are often unmanageable. And while this mob could manage to shout a slogan, they couldn't manage to get much done that made much sense. The city was filled with confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. The theater that's mentioned here, the remains of that theater are actually in pretty good condition to this day. It's been unearthed by modern archaeology, and that theater would have seated about 12,000 people. It was a large forum, a semicircular amphitheater kind of arrangement with capacity for about 12,000 spectators. And this is where the mob went, is into this theater. And we have mention here that they seized a couple of Paul's traveling companions, Gaius and Aristarchus, and these men were from Macedonia. And these men from Macedonia, this Gaius may very well be, or they at least had come from Macedonia here. This Gaius may well be, may or may not be, the same Gaius that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 1:14, who was from Corinth. And that was when Paul was saying, I remember I baptized the household of Stephanas, and I baptized Gaius, and not very many other people there. Very few people that he baptized in Corinth. But there was a Gaius in Corinth, who may have been the same Gaius here from Macedonia that was Paul's traveling companion. And Aristarchus. Romans 16:23 mentions Gaius again, who is host to me and the whole church, greet you, and that's in his letter to Corinth. Erastus, the city treasurer, that's in his letter to the Romans, written from Corinth. Erastus and the city treasurer, our brother Quartus, greet you. Aristarchus is mentioned again, and I'm sure this is the same Aristarchus, in Acts chapter 20, verse 4, and Acts 27, verse 2, and also in Colossians 4 and 10 as a traveling companion of Paul from Thessalonica in Macedonia. And the fact that these men are described as Macedonians, remember Timothy went, and he was supposed to go from Ephesus to Macedonia and to Achaia, and then he was supposed to come back to Paul in Ephesus. That's mentioned in Acts, and Paul mentions the coming back part in the 1 Corinthian letter that was written from Ephesus. So if he has these traveling companions from Macedonia, that suggests that Timothy had picked up these men along the way, and they have come now and are with Paul in Ephesus. And in fact, when we come to chapter 20 and verse 4, and Aristarchus is mentioned again, Aristarchus from Thessalonica in Macedonia, he is traveling with Paul now from Ephesus to Macedonia to Achaia, and then from Achaia to Troas, and from Troas on the way to Jerusalem. He's participating in this trip, carrying the funds from the churches to Jerusalem. But the fact that these Macedonian travelers are with Paul suggests that Timothy has made the full loop, and Timothy is back in Ephesus, which is indeed the scenario that we have when 1 Timothy is written. And I think that sets up the scene for 1 Timothy being written in the first couple verses of the 20th chapter of Acts, which we'll be talking about in the next video study here. But we have these men, Gaius, possibly the same Gaius that's mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1:14 and Romans 16:23, almost certainly the same Aristarchus who's mentioned in Acts chapter 20, verse 4, and Acts chapter 27 and verse 2. These men had come from Macedonia and had come and joined Paul's troop in Ephesus. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, well, Paul had faced all kinds of opposition before, and he mentioned in his Corinthian letter, we noted that in our previous segment here, that he had a great door of opportunity in Ephesus that God had opened to him, but he also had much opposition, many opponents. And so what was his solution to having opponents? Well, you go and you reason with them. That was what he had done over and over and over again. And he wanted to do that here. He wanted to go in among the crowd, and he wanted to talk to these people. But his friends recognized, and his friends here, the disciples, would not let him. And even some of the Asiarchs, and I'll just comment on this word Asiarchs, that this is a unique word that describes a particular class of leaders in this province. It's not the word that he used to describe the leaders in Philippi, or the word that he's used to describe leaders in various other locations. Luke always gets his vocabulary exactly right, and this is exactly the right word to describe the local governing officials here in Ephesus. It's exactly the right word for the place and time that he's writing about, and he always has those details right, which suggests that we can trust the whole story when he gets the minute details correct, that he is a very trustworthy historian and geographer and reporter of the things that have happened. So Luke mentions here the Asiarchs, who were friends of Paul, precise word for the leaders in that region of the world, that Paul had had an impact not only in the lower classes, but also in some folks in the upper classes, people who were his friends. Doesn't say that they necessarily were disciples, but they were friends of Paul, and they cared about what happened to him, and they may have been disciples that are singled out here, urging him not to venture into the theater. Don't go in among the crowd. The disciples would not let him. It almost sounds like they were physically restraining him. And the Asiarchs, these officials who were his friends, were pleading with him, don't go in among the crowd. Paul had left Damascus, going over the wall in a basket, because his life was threatened. But when he wrote about that in 2 Corinthians, he said that that was a sign of weakness, that he had fled in that way. He had had to flee for his life many times, but he never took that well. He did not like going away from a confrontation. He liked to confront those who disagreed with him and do his best to persuade them. And that was what he wanted to do here. But his friends and the other disciples saw that that was a course of folly, that this was not a crowd that was going to listen to him or reason with him. Rather, they were going to take out their hostility on him. And so they urged Paul, and they would not let Paul go into the theater with the mob that had seized the place. And some cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion. And I can't help but think about the fact that confusion just doesn't get anything done. You remember the Tower of Babel story in the 11th chapter of Genesis, and God came and stirred up their inability to understand one another, so that they spoke in different languages. And in confusion, they broke up and went in different directions. And this crowd is in confusion. They don't know what they're doing. They don't have a clear purpose. They don't have a clear leader or a clear agenda. Most of them did not know why they had come together, which didn't mean that they couldn't quote slogans. Some of them prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward. And again, I would suggest this Alexander may well have been a metal worker, and so may have been on the fringes of this business of calling the people of the same craft together. And they urged him, the Jews wanted him to speak to the crowd. Now, do you suppose that he would have tried to settle the crowd down? I don't suppose so. If the Jews put him forward, it was probably with a view toward directing the anger of the crowd against Paul. Some of the fiercest opponents that Paul had are going to come up in Acts chapters 21, 22, and they were in fact Jews from Ephesus, Jews who knew Paul from Asia, and totally disliked and distrusted him. And so I suspect that trying to put Alexander forward was not an intent to calm the crowd, but rather with the hope that Alexander would direct the hostility of the crowd against Paul and against the disciples there in Ephesus. He wanted to make a defense to the crowd, but not a defense of the Christians, not a defense of Paul by any means, but only a defense of the Jews, and adversarial with regard to Paul and the followers of the way. But when the mob recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." That part they could, except for the Jews, be united on. The Jews surely would not have joined together in that chant, repeated over and over again for 2 hours. But the mob in general repeated that, and that was the temper and the mood. So verse 35, when the town clerk had quieted the crowd. So here's someone now, a local official, and that doesn't sound like a terribly important position to us, but it was a very important position in that community. When the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, "Men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis?" And indeed, we've already had citations to the effect that not only these metal workers had that perspective, but travelers had that perspective, and there were shrines for this Artemis all over the Mediterranean world. There were coins that were in circulation that had the image of this Artemis on them. And so he says, this is too big to squelch. You don't need to have this fear. You don't need to think that these men are going to be able to squelch the power and the impact of Artemis of the Ephesians. The city of Ephesus is the temple keeper. We're greatly privileged, this thing that fell from the sky, and so forth. Seeing that these things cannot be denied, the role of Ephesus and the grandeur of the temple and the stone that had fallen from the sky, seeing that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. This is a little bit like Gamaliel, isn't it? When Gamaliel was urging the Sanhedrin not to take action against the 12 apostles. Because as he said it, if it's from the Lord, you're not going to be able to stop it, and if it's not from God, it's just going to diminish and go away. And this is a voice of reason in the hostility in Ephesus in a very similar way. Again, telling us that what happened in Jerusalem happens in Ephesus. This is human nature, and the power of God is undiminished and unchanged. So you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. You have brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. And that tells us, again, something about the way in which Paul preached. Did he confront idolatry? Yes. But was he abrasive? No. That wasn't his means of reasoning with people and trying to persuade them to follow Jesus Christ. They haven't done anything sacrilegious or blasphemous against our goddess. Paul preached the truth about idolatry, the truth about Jesus, But he was thoughtful when he went to the Areopagus in Athens, and I'm sure he was thoughtful in Ephesus, that the point is to persuade people, not to alienate people. If therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open. Take the path that they attempted to take with Gallio in Corinth. Bring this out in an official setting. But of course they had nothing to actually charge Paul with. He hadn't broken Roman law in what he was doing and what he was preaching. There are proconsuls, he said. Again, the right word for those who had judicial authority in that area. Let them take care of these things in a regular assembly, bringing charges against one another. Have Paul and his opponents working it out amongst themselves in a legitimate court. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in a regular assembly, for we are in danger of being charged. Romans did not take rioting calmly. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was brutally enforced. If a city rioted, the troops would come and settle issues. And they didn't particularly want troops to be sent into Ephesus to settle issues if they got a bad rap for the rioting. They needed to settle this down lest the Roman authorities react by calling in the troops, and a lot of people suffered and died and property damage and all of that. We are really in danger of being charged with rioting today, and they would have had fines to pay at the very least. This would have been a costly thing. It was important to come to order for the sake of the civic good of the community of Ephesus. There is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. Again, here is a city leader who, like Gallio, has come to the conclusion in regard to paganism. We have no charges here that have anything to do with Roman law. The Jews had no charges that had anything to do with Roman law. This has to do with particular religious thinking and nothing to do with Roman law. Again, a very important precedent and principle for the disciples and for the church. And when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. And so we have effectively the end of the story of what happened here in Acts chapter 19 in the city of Ephesus. Something more than 2 years, on the order approximating 3 years, that Paul worked in Ephesus and Asia, had a huge effect. A lot of people came to the Lord, a lot of congregations were started, a lot of men became evangelists who worked to establish other churches and worked alongside Paul in some of his travels. And so we have this very fruitful and effective work taking place in Ephesus. Next time, we're going to pick up with Paul after the uproar, leaving Ephesus, and starting that journey that he had intended to make, to go to Macedonia and Achaia and on to Jerusalem. But we'll also see how that journey was interrupted and how his plans didn't quite work out the way that he had hoped they would. But that's where we'll pick up next time, Acts chapter 20 and verse 1.